The first Libyan civil war began on 15 February 2011 and ended on 20th October. It began with a series of peaceful protests similar to those of the Arab Spring, later becoming a full-scale civil war between the forces loyal to Muammar Gaddafi's government and the anti-Gaddafi forces. Muammar Mohammed Abu Minyar Gaddafi, commonly known as Colonel Gaddafi, was a Libyan revolutionary, politician and political theorist.
You see, Colonel Muammar Gaddafi, he had come to power by a military revolution himself in 1969, and he ruled the country for about 42 years with an iron hand. He said often that I hold no official position, but he was all in all, everybody knew it. But Colonel Gaddafi was all powerful, had antagonized large number of global leaders, but championed the cause of Palestine. Therefore, he was liked by the streets quite a lot. He had supported a lot of African countries and tried to bring about, they paid them money, created infrastructure in those countries and all. So this was all taken as, so people in Africa especially liked him quite a bit, whereas the monarchs in the Gulf countries virtually hated them. And that's what came handy when the Western countries wanted this revolution to succeed or provide the support. So this is what happened. Uh, his 42 years rule was despotic and decrepit, to say the least. And it discontented the whole country. Initiative generally in such kind of situations is not allowed very much. Political discontent is not allowed. So obviously there was a lot of discontent at the grassroots level, but nobody could speak. So when the situation arose in 2011 and 10, people just took to the streets, and they started recalling all the horrific things that were done, especially Abu Salim prison massacre became the main rallying point for the people, apart from their own individual discontent and the dissatisfaction they had against the state. But he did not allow any protest. There was no way that you could really vent out your grievances. But at the same time, he had become a bit crazier that he started his own Green Book. And Green Book actually imbibed his eccentric philosophy, so to say the least. And this brought in about quasi-religious conservatism in their system, which was actually seen as archaic. So even though he had begun to enjoy his friendship with the Western leaders in the last few years of his reign, he never thought that he'll be deceived by the same, because he started pumping in money in those countries. It's a rich country, but he had miscalculated again the role of the mostly the colonial countries with that mindset that they wanted to control the place, and therefore this became. In fact, it is surprising that in Reagan, during the wake of in the wake of 9/11, he was called as that mad dog of Middle East, and then he became the valued ally in the war on terror.
On February 15, 2011, anti-government rallies were held in Benghazi by protesters.
The revolution that happened, that started on February 17 in Benghazi, was actually due to the prolonged problems and complaints of the people. This was also due to the backdrop of the so-called Arab Spring that had started in December of 2010 in Tunisia. And a hawker had immolated himself, that led to demonstrations, public protests, and eventual leaving of their longtime president, Ben Ali. After that, the revolution again moved to Egypt, where again in 18 days' time, the regime of President Mubarak went out of it. This gave some kind of comfort to the ordinary Libyans, especially people from the eastern part of Libya in Benghazi, who felt that a time has come where we can remove Gaddafi.
The protesters called for Gaddafi to step down and for the release of the political prisoners. Libyan security forces retaliated with water cannons and rubber bullets against the crowds, resulting in a number of injuries.
Oh my God. They are fighting the civilians here. They are crazy. They are going crazy here.
As the protests intensified, with demonstrators taking control of Benghazi and unrest spreading to Tripoli, the Libyan government began using lethal force against demonstrators. Security forces and squads of mercenaries fired live ammunition into crowds of demonstrators. Demonstrators also were attacked with tanks and artillery, and from the air with warplanes and helicopter gunships. The regime restricted communications, blocking the internet and interrupting telephone service throughout the country. The government's sudden escalation of violence against protesters and other civilians drew international condemnation from foreign leaders and human rights organizations. It also seemed to damage the coherence of the regime, causing a number of high-level officials, including the Minister of Justice and a number of senior Libyan diplomats, including the Libyan ambassador to the United Nations, to resign in protest or issue statements condemning the regime. A number of Libyan embassies around the world began to fly Libya's pre-Gaddafi flag, signaling support for the uprising.
للملايين من الصحراء إلى الصحراء وسنزحف أنا والملايين لتطهير ليبيا شبر شبر بيت بيت دار دار زنقة زنقة فرد فرد حتى تطهر البلد من الدنس والإرجاس. لا يمكن نسمح لليبيا تضيع بين ايدينا.
On February 22nd, Gaddafi delivered an angry, rambling speech on state television, condemning the protesters as traitors and calling on his supporters to fight them. The speech took place in the Bab al-Azizia compound, Gaddafi's primary headquarters in Tripoli, in front of a building that still showed extensive damage from a 1986 airstrike by the United States. He resisted calls to step down and vowed to remain in Libya. Although he denied having used force against protesters, he repeatedly vowed to use violence to remain in power.
A huge chunk of eastern Libya has revolted and is no longer under the control of Muammar Gaddafi's government. In towns like Tobruk, army deserters have taken over the military bases.
Clashes continued, and Gaddafi's hold on power weakened as Libyan military units increasingly sided with the opposition against the regime. The newly armed rebel forces were able to expel most pro-Gaddafi troops from the eastern portion of Libya, including the city of Benghazi and many western cities by February 23rd.
Gaddafi was one leader whom nobody liked, except some of his friends and colleagues in Africa. Most of the Arab country leaders did not like him. He hated the monarchs, and therefore he hated the West. But for the last few years before his death, he had started befriending because one of his sons, Saif al-Islam, was actually educated in the UK and was a modern figure who was trying to modernize Libya, and he realized that it is not possible to continue to have a warpath with the Western powers, and the sanctions on Libya were also affecting them, and therefore they tried to do something, but this was too late by then. And the Western countries, especially his friends, so-called French, the British, the Italians, decided it was time for Gaddafi to go, where they could also prove that they can bring about democracy of sorts. And that's why they started supporting the groups. And the people in Benghazi, mainly in the eastern part of Libya, were very unhappy. And they were unhappy because of the kind of tortures, because of deaths, because of arrests, and the basic neglect of the region that had happened there, which created a very big discontent among the people. And then they started an Abu Salim massacre of more than 1,300 people were killed there. Abu Salim was a prison, and that became a major thing for them. And therefore, on 17th February, they decided to call for the revolution, the demonstrations.
Right now, the U.S. Treasury Department has $37 billion worth of funds that were accessible to Muammar Gaddafi and his regime frozen.
International pressure for Gaddafi to step down increased as violence continued and foreign nationals were evacuated. Sanctions were exacted against the Gaddafi regime, imposing a travel ban and an arms embargo and freezing the Gaddafi family's assets.
More than anything, his people wanted us to see that Gaddafi is not hiding and has not fled, but remains here in Tripoli, perhaps his last stronghold.
Amid continuing skirmishes, as rebel forces strengthened their positions outside Tripoli, Gaddafi invited a number of Western journalists to the city in an attempt to demonstrate that the situation remained under control.
Could you tell something about the negotiation between Benghazi and Tripoli?
A rebel leadership council formed by the merger of local rebel groups appeared in Benghazi in early March. Known as the Transitional National Council (TNC), it declared that its aims would be to act as the rebellion's military leadership and as the representative of the Libyan opposition, provide services in rebel-held areas, and guide the country's transition to democratic government. International condemnation of Gaddafi's regime continued to build, and at an emergency summit on March 11, the EU unanimously called for Gaddafi to step down. A no-fly zone was also imposed over Libya, a measure long requested by rebels to prevent Gaddafi loyalists from launching air attacks.
There is a rumor that Gaddafi was very close to Sarkozy, President Sarkozy of France, and he had even given him 80 million euros for his campaign, which was later on found to be correct. So Gaddafi was very hopeful that his friends will not dump him, and therefore he continued to use harder methods, stronger methods, and wanted to do some kind of a Tiananmen against the protesters, and which was actually backfired and boomeranged on him. And the people eventually took over Tripoli, both from Benghazi side, and he ran away to Sirte, which was his birthplace.
On March 15, the UNSC voted 10-0 with abstentions from Russia, China, Germany, India and Brazil to authorize military action. Beginning March 19th, a coalition of US and European forces with warplanes and cruise missiles attacked targets in Libya in an effort to disable Libya's air force and air defense systems so that the UN-authorized no-fly zone could be imposed. Coalition missiles struck buildings in a compound used by Gaddafi as a command center, and in eastern Libya, warplanes attacked a pro-Gaddafi armored column positioned outside Benghazi. Emboldened by the airstrikes, rebel forces once again launched an offensive to challenge pro-Gaddafi forces' hold on the oil centers of the coast. Gaddafi denounced the coalition attacks as an act of aggression against Libya and vowed to continue fighting international forces and the rebels. Muammar Gaddafi was captured and killed on 20th October 2011 during the Battle of Sirte. He was captured by National Transitional Council forces. He was killed shortly afterwards. The NTC initially claimed he died from injuries sustained in a firefight when loyalist forces attempted to free him. 3 days later, the NTC declared Libya to be officially liberated and announced its plans to hold elections within 8 months. In November, Saif al-Islam, the fugitive son of former Libyan leader Gaddafi, was captured and became the last key Gaddafi family member to be seized or killed.
I was not in Libya at the time of the rebellion or revolution as it is called. It's called February 17 Revolution. I was posted in Moscow, in Russia at the time, but as part of my job, being the Deputy Chief of Mission in the rank of Ambassador and in charge for the political matters, I was dealing with my Russian friends and colleagues and trying to monitor the situation that was happening. India was also part of the UN Security Council in that time in 2010, 11, 12, and therefore we had a greater responsibility, and we were coordinating exactly what was happening with our Russian friends, who were continuing to go and talk to Gaddafi and try to talk to some of the opposition also, so that some kind of a deal could be made, and therefore there could be possibility. And the rebellion came, the victory came to them. October 20th was the day when he was killed, and that's when they declared their victory. But at the same time, the Libya was in a very bad position, because by then there was no plan by the Western countries as to what will they do once Gaddafi goes. There were no institutions. There were no plan at all how the democracy will be brought in. But the people wanted democracy. They wanted to have elections. They wanted everything. But this did not help them, because there was no system at all. And the benefactors had no clue what was going to happen. Most importantly, there was no army. Or most of these militias were fighting one against the other or against the Gaddafi's armies, they all got together and they had their own forces they were trying to control, and the competition among those forces began. So there were hundreds of militia groups and they were controlling the areas like mohallas, and this was something that has given a problem, and that is a problem until today. And problem has been compounded further because the various countries chose these groups to support. So if UK, France support one, the Italians will support the other Islamist group. If Turkey will support the Islamists, Qatar will support the Islamists, UAE and Saudi Arabia will support the people from Benghazi, Egypt will support the people from Benghazi. So all these countries, USA also played both sides. So this had given, they were providing arms, ammunition in a country where more than 26 million arms were supposed to be there in among 6 million people. So it was a very bad, very, very bad situation.
At 9:40 p.m. on September 11th, members of Ansar al-Sharia attacked the American diplomatic compound in Benghazi, resulting in the deaths of US Ambassador to Libya J. Christopher Stevens and US Foreign Service Information Management Officer Sean Smith. At around 4 a.m. on September 12th, the group launched a mortar attack against the CIA annex approximately 1 mile away, killing CIA contractors Tyrone S. Woods and Glenn Doherty. Initial analysis by the CIA, repeated by top government officials, indicated that the attack spontaneously arose from a protest. Subsequent investigations showed that the attack was premeditated. All the rioters and looters not originally part of the group may have joined in after the attacks began. Afterwards, the United States withdrew its troops from the area.
India had taken a stance that it will not support the military intervention at the United Nations, and we were there as a non-permanent member. We did not want, so we abstained on Resolution 1973, which was shown as a support to Gaddafi by various countries who were there, the Western countries, because they thought that India was with Russia and China and was supporting Gaddafi in that sense. But that was not true. Our ambassador, the previous lady ambassador, Ms. Manime Clive, was called by Gaddafi, and in turn they had called the BRICS ambassadors essentially. And our ambassador told them that, listen, you should have a dialogue with the revolutionaries, with the protesters, and resolve it locally. Resolve it yourself. But after her meeting, the media played it out very differently. They said, oh, we'll give oil blocks to India, India will send army, India will do this and that, and which naturally played down at the great mass level. And and our embassy was vandalized, and we had left our embassy at the time and moved to Tunisia, our ambassador. But when I arrived there, I straight went to Tripoli and stayed in a hotel till such time that my embassy residence was properly prepared for me to stay. But on the grassroots level, I had seen how difficult it was for us, because people, they just started, the ordinary people, they started disliking India. They started virtually hating India. Many of our big companies who were employing thousands of Indians were vandalized. They lost billions of dollars. So all the goodwill and faith that we had for years together was lost because of 2 or 3 things. Then we took a little longer to recognize the National Transition Council, which was the interim body. So they also were unhappy with us. Therefore, my basic job was essentially to somehow neutralize this negative perception which had been created about India, and that's what I did during that period, and tried to secure the interests of India so Indian companies could be welcomed back. And it was as a result of the Indian government's efforts, our embassy efforts, that we not only procured they started the contracts and all, but we started getting some very new contracts, which were the big ones, about $700 million, and that was a very big achievement given the circumstances that all the Western countries were virtually opposing us. And now, as far as Indian citizens were concerned, fortunately, till such time that Gaddafi was in power, they ensured that the Indian people can be evacuated. A large number of Indians, 18,000 Indians, were evacuated by ship, by air, by road. and many of them refused to come because Gaddafi said that whosoever is going to stay here, his salary will become 3-4 times. So large number of people did not come. In fact, one of our ships only came back with 7-8 people. So after that, unfortunately, 2014 May, when I left, I found it that next 2 years were extremely difficult. Until today, it continues. The country has 2 prime ministers and 2 presidents and 2 parliaments, and they are fighting one against the other. General Haftar controls it on the eastern side, and on the right hand, on the western side, West Tripoli government, which is which has been generally said to be an internationally recognized government of Faiz al-Sarraj, is also has a presidential council, but they all have lost people's faith. Libyans continue to suffer, unfortunately, and I really feel very sad about it. Now, I think that we just hope that Libya will retain some kind of sanity.
While the Arab Spring had ended, repercussions of the rebellion unfolded in an Arab winter that till now is the cause for massive civil unrest, protests, injustice, as well as human rights violations in Libya.